Now, not to be cruel or anything, but starting on about page 121, I'm hoping that this text took you an enormous amount of time to read, because you should be stopping about every sentence or two to experiment with the sounds that they're describing. You should be shifting the movement of your tongue between different sounds, and the movement of your lips, and the movement of your voicing, and you should be holding your hand in front of your mouth to feel the aspiration, and you should be holding your throat to feel the vibrations. And by experimenting with all these different sounds, you'll see the kinds of things that Sedivy is talking about. But it's impossible for me on this recording here to demonstrate all the things that she's trying to describe for us, so I'm just going to hit the highlights and I'm going to leave the specific details to you. Now, an important concept here in this part of the chapter is understanding that the human vocal tract can make a limited number of sounds, but those sounds are going to be differentially carved up across languages. That some languages will care more about certain distinctions than other languages do. And within a language, when we carve up the sounds so that the meaning of a word can be changed depending on how you make that sound, then that is called a phoneme. On the other hand, if our articulation of a specific sound will influence how easily we comprehend it within that word, but it wouldn't actually change the meaning of the word, then that's considered an allophone. Now, the categorical distinctions between sounds in English are going to be different than the categorical distinctions in other languages. Some of the distinctions that we make and consider to be phonemes are actually going to be merely allophones in other languages, and vice versa. Now, here are a couple of examples. In English, the sounds made by the letters T and D, T and D, are exactly the same quality of difference as they would be in other languages. But in English, we consider them phonemes. We consider that distinction between T and D to be a very huge one, even though they're actually the exact same sound, except that one is voiced and one is voiceless. You can see that distinction in figure 4.6. There, you see that one is highlighted in blue and one is highlighted in green. And by seeing that distinction, you can see that the other aspects, like the place of articulation and the manner of articulation, are exactly the same. And if you were to say those two sounds to yourself and experiment, you would notice that the tongue is in the exact same place, doing the exact same thing for both of those sounds. The difference arises in your vocal folds. If you put your hand right on your throat, you will feel a vibration when you say D, but you won't feel one when you say T. Now, importantly, that distinction in sounds is exactly the same distinction in other languages, but some languages won't care about the difference. Rather, they will underplay it, and it will be an allophonic difference. In such a situation, the two sounds will be represented by the same characters, the same letters, and individuals wouldn't be able to hear the difference easily. And when they were learning English, they would struggle to understand the difference between a T and a D, that one was voiced and one was voiceless. And even though they could make the two different sounds in their own language, embedded into words, they would struggle to make the two different sounds. My favorite example of this is in the Japanese and Korean languages, where they make a sound that's sort of between an R and an L, and they don't make a distinction between the two, whereas we care a great deal about the distinction between an R and an L, and we make very few sounds that are like a combination or somewhere halfway between the two. So when somebody who is Japanese tries to learn English, they struggle with that distinction, and you might find them saying something like, "I will make some fried rice," instead of fried rice. Now, because of our egocentric perspective, these are easier examples to understand than examples where we consider two sounds to be allophones, but other languages treat them as phonemes. One example of that is the difference between the aspirated and unaspirated T in Thai language. We represent both of those sounds using the letter T as the same letter, whereas in Thai, they represent those two sounds with different characters. If you try to say the word tan without aspirating, in the same way that you say stan, it will be very difficult for you. Whereas somebody who speaks Thai would not struggle with that distinction at all. They would be able to make both of those sounds. So try it for a minute. Put your hand or a match in front of your mouth and notice when the air puffs out of your mouth, when it comes out like a jet. I'm serious. Pause this recording and try to say that word without aspirating. Try to say it without making a puff of air. Notice that you can do it easily when you say the word stan. But when you say the word tan, it's almost impossible for you to have the articulatory control to stop yourself from aspirating. Now, as we turn to page 130 and look at figure 4.10, those previous examples should help us to understand and interpret this graph. The difference between pa and ba for us sounds very extreme, and yet it's actually a very subtle one. The difference is composed only of a difference in voice onset time. That's the lag, if any, between the time when our vocal folds begin to vibrate and the time when our lips separate to make that sound. In ba, there is no voice onset difference. In pa, there is a 100 millisecond voice onset time delay. Now, in English, we make a very clear categorical distinction between these two sounds. Now, the way that we know we have this categorical distinction in perception is if we look at panel A in this figure. It maps out here for us what percentage of people should be hearing the sound pa when the voice onset time is -20 versus -10 versus 0 milliseconds in voice onset time versus 10 versus 20 versus 30, and so on. Now, given that voice onset time is a continuous variable, we would expect that the percentage of people identifying this sound as ba or as pa would follow in a linear fashion, that it would increase gradually as voice onset time increases, or decrease gradually as voice onset time increases, depending on which sound we're talking about. That they should cross somewhere in the middle, and that this distinction should be a gradual one. But rather what we see is that when we map out people's actual performance on this task, people make a categorical distinction between the voice onset time. Up to about 10 milliseconds, we perceive the sound as ba all the time and never as pa. Even if it's 5 milliseconds or if it's -5 milliseconds voice onset time, it doesn't seem to matter. There is some gray area between 10 and 30 milliseconds of voice onset time when people will perceive it as pa or ba differentially depending on certain circumstances or the individual's own bias. But once it reaches about 30 milliseconds, then people exclusively will perceive the syllable as pa and never as ba. Because this is the pattern of results that we actually observe, we suggest that the differences that we hear are actually in perception rather than in actual differences among sounds. That two sounds within one language, because they've been overemphasized within that language, can be perceived as very different, whereas those same exact two sounds in a different language might be perceived as very similar to each other because they've been underemphasized. Now, given that we have this kind of categorical perception, some researchers have wondered whether these categories line up with naturally occurring categories that are born into infants, or whether infants have to learn these categorical distinctions with time. Apparently, the research suggests that infants are born with built-in categorical boundaries that sort of are in line with what's going on in the auditory system anyway. And the reason why we know that is because we've done some research that varies not only voice onset time, as I just described, but also tone onset time in a melodic kind of task. And people did just as well in the tone onset time as they did in the voice onset time, and they made the same kinds of distinctions in both tasks, regardless of whether it was linguistically based or just musically based. Now, this finding suggests to us that there must be some kind of boundary system in the auditory system built in that allows us to make these distinctions easily at some points, and maybe that they're harder at other points. It further suggests that this is the case when we look in the animal kingdom, and we find that, as we see on page 133, that chinchillas can also make the same kind of categorical distinctions between sounds that humans can. That means that it must not be so much about language as it is about the sound system that we're dealing with. Still, we find that some languages, like Mandarin, carve up the sound distinctions in odd places that aren't naturally aligned with those boundaries that infants are born with, or that chinchillas distinguish between. And in those cases, we just have to remember that infants are born with the ability to distinguish between virtually any two phonemes. It only comes after some period of training and time and development that infants cease hearing the differences between any sounds. But every infant born has the capacity to learn the native language of his or her parents, regardless of what that language is. So Japanese-born infants can hear the distinctive sounds between R and L, as an English baby can, but they will lose the ability to distinguish between those two phonemes when they get older, because those phonemes aren't distinguished in Japanese. Similarly, an American infant will be born with the capacity to hear the difference between an aspirated and an unaspirated T, but will stop making that distinction as it grows. And we think that part of the reason for this is due to the synaptic pruning in the brains of young children. Infants are born with all of the neurons that they're going to have in their entire life. When they're born, they have pretty unnetworked neurons. In other words, they have the number of cells that they'll ever have, but they have a relatively few connections. And as they develop in the first years of life, their brains are proliferated with billions upon billions of connections. And only as they develop through the first couple of years of life do they realize, again, I'm anthropomorphizing, the cells don't realize anything, but it's sort of as if the cells realize which of these connections are going to be important. And those are the ones that are maintained throughout the lifespan, and all the connections that were made that aren't being used and aren't important are pruned away or killed off. Now, what that means for the infant is that he or she, around the age of 2, 3, 4 years old, is left with a brain carved to its individual culture and experience and language. It's a really brilliant system, except that it leaves us incapacitated to learn to hear the sounds that exist in other languages, and so we can no longer, as adults, grasp those sounds, hear those distinctions, and really masterfully learn languages that use different sounds than our own native languages.